Thank you. I hope everybody is enjoying lunch. We wanted to make sure that during today's keynote we had a quiet room, because I don't think you're going to want to miss any of the information our keynote speaker is going to provide. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote introductory sponsor, Bill Brady Jr., the Managing Director for KPMG. Bill leads the Life Sciences Group nationally for KPMG and is a board member of the WBA. Please join me in welcoming Bill Brady to the podium.
Well, thanks, Chris, for the opportunity. As you mentioned, I'm Bill Brady. I work for KPMG. And contrary to the discussion I had this morning, KPMG is not a radio station. We are a public accounting firm doing audit, tax, and advisory services. And we support the life science industry from discovery to delivery and beyond, and are very proud to be members of the WBBA as well as sponsors of the Life Science Innovation Northwest. On behalf of the partners, the management and staff of KPMG, it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Steve Burrill. I have known Steve and followed him over the last few years. He's well known in the industry, and he's been involved in the growth and prosperity of this industry for over 40 years now. Steve's one of the original architects of the industry and is one of the most avid and sustained developers. He serves as chairman of the boards on Pharmaset, Bioimage, and Abunda Corporation. He's a member of the board of directors at Catalyst Bioscience, Depomed, Iconotherapeutics, Newbridge, Proteogenics, Proventus, Targacept, and XDX. Before founding Burrill Company in 1994, he spent 28 years with my former firm, Ernst & Young, directing services to clients in the biotech, life science, high-tech, and manufacturing industries worldwide. In 2002, he was recognized as the Biotech Investment Visionary by the Scientific American magazine. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Burrill Company, a San Francisco-based life science firm focused exclusively on companies involved in the human healthcare, which is biotech, pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, devices, medical technologies, healthcare delivery, nutraceuticals and wellness, as well as bio-green tech, which is the agricultural biotechnology, industrial biotechnology, biomaterials, bioprocesses, and biofuels. Burrill Company's businesses revolve around 4 core activities: venture capital, private equity, merchant banking, and media. I introduce to you Steve Burrill.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'll tell you in advance that I have about 200 slides, and I'm going to do it in a little less than an hour. I'll also tell you that I kind of pissed everybody off at Bio when I gave the speech and told them I would give them my slides afterwards, and then they went out front and found out that they had to pay $350 and buy my book to get my slides. So as a special gift to all of you, we're going to sell our book and our slides for 99 bucks, and you can get it from the booth. But I think the place to start really is what are some of the crises that we're trying to solve. And I think it's important to recognize that we live in a world today where the problems we're trying to solve are really important. One is, and I'll talk a lot about it, and as many of you know, I've talked a lot about it for a while, which is the demographics of aging. And it's interesting, and you'll hear a little more about this in my talk. We as a society have decided that aging is a disease. And defining aging as a disease means that we need to find a solution. We need to treat it as a disease. That's an interesting concept to think about. And so I'll tease you with that a little bit now. But the demographics of aging on a global basis, China, for example, is a country with 1.2 billion people, but it has 300 million people over 65 years of age. It's got 1 United States of aged people. So while it's a young, vibrant country, it's also a country facing enormous healthcare challenges. Secondly, we have this thing called the diabesity crisis, the combination of diabetes and obesity, which is a humongous problem in the world. Some of you may know that we just got the first obesity drug approved last week. And most of us want to eat and drink and party, and then we want to take a pill and be thin. And so the opportunity both to solve the problem, we have exported our lifestyle around the world, and so we have populations who are genetically not able to deal with the diets that we have today, and that's changed things. So the obesity crisis is a major hunk of where we spend a lot of our time. I think many of you know that 76% of our costs in the United States for healthcare is for chronic care. We're keeping all the people alive that used to die. That's good. It's also expensive, and so we have to deal with that. And we're at the end of the era of blockbusterology. That is to say, we've lived in a world of kind of one-size-fits-all drugs, and we're done with that. We talked a little bit this morning in the presentation by Jeff about the role that Gates and others are trying to play with the impact of poverty and disease, and we have enormous burden of disease in populations that have no ability to pay for that. And yet we're exporting that disease into the more developed parts of the world. I'll be in New York tonight, I'll be in Dallas and Houston tomorrow, and I'll be in Beijing on Saturday, and that's the way we live. We zip around the world and move diseases around the world very quickly. And so we have an enormous challenge. And that some of the problems like tuberculosis and AIDS are interesting because they're problems of the developed world. But if you take malaria and leishmania and some of the problems that we're trying to deal with are problems of the undeveloped world, and those places have no economics to pay for the diseases, and therefore there's no economics to encourage you and I to invest in building technology around that. So Gates and others have stepped into that, but that's a giant problem. And then I would just mention that we live in a world where we use words interesting. We talk about our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is not a healthcare system. It's a totally dysfunctional sickness care system. We are moving to the beginnings of a healthcare system, that is to say, to treat a well population preemptively rather than a sick population dysfunctionally. But don't misunderstand the complexity of moving from a dysfunctional sickness care system to an increasingly functional wellness care system. 20% of our GDP in this country is spent on healthcare. Those people aren't going to move themselves off the island quickly. That is to say, we have enormous perverse incentives to keep doing things the way we do it. One of the reasons we have all the politics around healthcare reform is everybody wants it to be done differently, but if you make your living in that system, you don't want to be marginalized. And I'll give you some examples in my talk in a minute. But moving from this dysfunctional sickness care system to an increasingly functional wellness, preemptive wellness care system is very, very dramatic. And you will see that happen over the next 10 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the crisis of economics, because keeping us all alive forever is interesting, particularly as you begin to get a little older, it becomes a lot more interesting. But it's not economic to do that. We can't keep everybody alive. So maybe we'll give everybody a right to live a great life till they're 100, and then we shoot them because the next generation has to come along. But we are moving the aging very, very dramatically, and the economic consequences of that will bankrupt the world. And so those are the crises that we're dealing with. And fortunately, this is probably the best time in the history of mankind to be in the business that we're in. So while it may sound like I'm writing the obituary for the industry as I start this, I'm going to end this with extraordinary optimism, because we have the technologies in front of us and groups like this that will be solving these crises and bringing solutions to the world. But how are we doing? Quite frankly, if you took a year ago when I was on this stage to today, it's gotten a little bit worse. It's not too pretty today. One, the economy of the world is soft and probably getting softer. We seem to get more and less confident every day about whether we've solved the debt crisis in Europe. We haven't solved it. If you run around Europe, you see there's massive unemployment. There's massive dislocation between the Germans, who think everybody should work hard, and the people in Southern Europe who don't work quite as hard, and the social programs are big. And so there's tremendous tension in the world today that's going to continue. And the stock market is pretty volatile because of that, but don't think for a minute that we've solved those problems. And the economy in the United States is even weaker. And we would like to think that it's a good economy and we're coming out of it, and you can see various elements. We on the West Coast are a little less affected than other parts of the country. But don't misunderstand that we built this industry over 45 years in a period of by and large economic expansion and relatively easy and cheap access to capital, and we don't have that today. And you can see countries around the world whose debt is 150 and 200% of their GDP. So the question in front of all of us is, what are we doing here? Why are we in this business? Do we need innovation, and what is innovation all about? Well, first of all, we do need innovation. Innovation is the answer to these crises. It's the answer to the aging population. It's the answer to chronic disease. It's the ability to become more personalized. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It allows us to move from just treating disease to move us to prevention. We're seeing lots of technology to do that. And it will allow us to move from a world that we live in today that assumes we are all the same, and therefore we should treat us all the same. And yet we know as scientists we're all quite different. And it's the little nuances of differences between us that cause some of us to be taller, shorter, some of us to get some diseases and not, some of us to metabolize drugs differently and so forth. So we're very much leaving this kind of one-size-fits-all world that we've lived in into a very, very different world. 20%, as I said, of our economy in the United States is healthcare. That's not just a US challenge, it's the same way around the world. But increasing burden of that is falling to us publicly. If you look at the Accountable Care Act, which the Supreme Court just validated for a minute, we added 32 million more Americans to the healthcare system. We didn't add a single hospital, doctor, nurse, or drug. So basic economics would say if you increase the demand side very dramatically, what's going to happen? Things are going to go up. It's not going to get cheaper. So the real question is, how do we pay for the system? A, we're keeping everybody alive, and B, we're providing enormous health care for everybody. And the public is paying the bill, and the public can't afford it. And so notwithstanding the Supreme Court, interestingly enough, the marketplace has moved far faster than the political system has. So for our industry, it doesn't matter what happens at the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter what happens in Washington. We are transforming the marketplaces ahead of us using technology around us. Statistics like the OECD and others would show that the problems that I'm talking about are the same problems everywhere in the world. And these diseases that we have, we move from kind of infectious disease to a whole series of diseases today that are really non-communicable, but are representing extraordinary burden on the system. Cancer, diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, just to name a few, are all things in some respect that are a result of both nature and nurture, how we live, and how we're hardwired. We know as scientists we're hardwired for lots of things, but genes are not our destiny. So we smoke, we drink, we behave badly, we do silly things. We don't behave to maintain our state of wellness. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today as we get into this a little bit is there's no real incentive for you to stay well. That is to say, you have no cost of your sickness. Your government pays for it, your employer pays for it, your insurance company pays for it. The only piece of your cost of sickness may be a tiny copay. And as those copays begin to go up, people are beginning to say, wow, it's expensive to be sick. And if we had to pay for our cost of sickness, we as societies would manage our state of wellness. If you think about your car, we maintain our car. We go take quarterly checkups, you maintain the tires, you do oil changes, you do all this stuff to your car because you don't want your car to wear out. We just live, and we wear out too. We don't maintain ourselves. So as we move from this kind of system that we have to where we're beginning to manage the cost of sickness, that is to say, you and I pay for our cost of sickness, you behave pretty quickly, differently. So the incentives are not to stay well. The incentives right now have no penalty if you get sick. You see the demand, the cause of the non-communicable diseases. So then the challenge to us is we begin to recognize that we're, as society is getting older, but we've now said it's a disease. And that's an interesting phenomenon. Because as a disease, then we want to treat it. We want to prevent your Alzheimer's. We want to prevent your osteoporosis. And we can look at something like Alzheimer's, and you can see that early intervention has dramatic cost benefit. And so even though you may still get it, if you can just delay it 5 years, the benefit to societies are extraordinary. So it's not like in dealing with aging, we're going to stop aging, but we are going to improve dramatically the quality of life for all of us as we age. Now, some of you that have heard me speak before, I'll tell you a story that some of you may have heard, but I'm on the faculty at UCSF. This is the med school of the University of California system in San Francisco. And there's a lady named Cynthia Kenyon there who's one of the leading researchers on aging. And most of us in biology use these C. elegans, these little worms, because they're a good model organism. Their genome is 99.9% homologous to our genome, so you can do a lot of research on them, and they act just like we do. But those little worms live 14 days, so birth to death in 14 days. In Cynthia's lab, they live 144 days, so 10 times. So is there a genetic switch in you and I that if we can control, we can change aging? The answer scientifically is absolutely yes. We know that. We know C. elegans lives 14 days. We know that sea turtles live 250 years. We know that we live as mankind about 78 to 80 years. There are genetic switches that now we're beginning to understand. So not only can we be preemptive about your Alzheimer's or your osteoporosis, but we can begin to tinker with the various genetics in us that begin to control our aging. And for this generation, those of us that are alive today, this isn't science fiction. This is real. This is absolutely things that we will do in our lifetime that is transformative. And so it's interesting, if you put yourself in the job as the health minister of the United States, what do you think your job is? Well, your job is to try and figure out how you pay for as much as you can for as many people as you can. So if you think about that, you're the health minister of the United States, so what do? A, you buy generic drugs. They're cheaper than ethical drugs, so generics are now 75% of the drugs used in America are generic drugs. You see countries like India who've said, we're going to give generic drugs away for free. Now, that has some impact to us. We're in the innovation business. We want to be paid and rewarded for the innovation we're taking, and we're living in a world in which the health ministers around the world say we're going to give generic drugs away for free because we need to treat things. But if you're the health minister of the United States today and you're going to spend a lot of money on Alzheimer's, how important is that? So how important is it for us to treat a society where maybe my 85-year-old mother or grandmother may not go south as fast? Maybe it's a lot better to treat a 30-year-old person or maybe a baby preemptively. And so as you begin to think about spending money on Alzheimer's, you can ask yourself, big pharmacoeconomics, how much is society going to pay to delay old Steve's Alzheimer's 5 years? It isn't worth much to society. It might be worth a lot for me. So if my kids or myself or an individual wants to do it, that's fine, but you have to ask yourself, will societies? So as we deal with all these diseases of the aging, it's really interesting if you put your health minister hat on and say, how much are we willing to as societies pay for that? That's some of the challenges that we have. And in the politics of it, we talk now about death panels and things that have a lot of sound bitology that's interesting, but the fact is we are rationing healthcare. And the only way we will deal as a world is to figure out what we pay for and what we don't pay for and why it works. So one lesson that's come out of this is that not only do we have to do the clinical development today, but you have to do the development of the pharmacoeconomics along with that, because the payers aren't going to pay for stuff that doesn't add value and reduce cost. So we built an industry where the issues were safety and efficacy. You had to prove it was safe and you had to prove it worked. And if you did, you got it approved and you threw it over the wall and the system paid for it. That's not the system going forward. The system is only going to pay for things that add value and reduce cost. So you won't see in the formal FDA literature anywhere pharmacoeconomic efficiency, but if you want to get a drug approved today, you're going to have to prove it's better or cheaper than stuff in the market. Who bears the burden of that? We do. We do. The innovators do. That's a great give to the big companies. The big companies, the stuff in the market, doesn't have to prove that they're better and cheaper than my innovation. We have to prove that our innovation is better and cheaper than stuff in the market. So we've added an enormous burden that we've taken on in this room because we now have the pharmacoeconomic challenge that we not only have to prove safety and efficacy, but we have to prove pharmacoeconomic efficiency. So the challenge then to us as an industry is getting bigger. So what does this do to our friends in Big Pharma for a minute? Well, Big Pharma is essentially the dinosaurs of our generation. The question is, can they modify their behavior? Can they modify their business model fast enough to not become extinct? And so the pharmaceutical company model was built really around blockbusters, building big drugs that you could sell, as Lipitor was, a $14 billion product for Pfizer. It was an industry built around large and complex trials, and if you think about that for a minute, the larger and more complex it was an enormous barrier to entry. Small companies like us can't compete because it was too expensive, so that was the province of big companies. And then they promoted those products with extensive marketing and distribution all over the world. So you had little people running around to every doctor in every office trying to promote those drugs. But Medicare now is going to buy 80% of the drugs sold in America. So what you really need to do is send one person to CMS and get on the formularies. So now you see Big Pharma trying to get rid of all of their detail people because that is non-functional. They recognize that it's cheaper to buy technology than it is to develop technology. So now they're buying biotechs. That's good for us. And they recognize that these one-size-fits-all drugs aren't the world of the future. And so everything that was important to Big Pharma doesn't work any longer. And if you think about Big Pharma, they were big on discovery and development. Well, we're good on discovery and development. Discovery and development is ubiquitous today. They were good on development, clinical development. Well, the CRO industry has offloaded that. If you want to do clinical development today, you hire somebody outside the company to do that for you. Manufacturing, move up the next level, manufacturing. A Big Pharma best at manufacturing? No, you can get the people in Poland or India or China or other places to do contract manufacture cheaper. So if you think about Big Pharma, it was an industry built vertically from discovery and development and manufacturing and marketing. And now you got to turn that ocean liner from a vertical organization to a horizontal organization, because what they need to do is sell and distribute drugs very effectively and get rid of all of this. So every day you read that Pfizer's closed their R&D plant, or Merck just unloaded 6,000 employees or 10,000 employees. And so the question to these guys, if you're CEO of any one of these companies, is can you change fast enough before the world just beats a path to somebody else's door? And if you look historically at other industries, you see companies like you see here in Seattle, you see companies like Microsoft grow up out of nothing to be giant companies today because they saw the world differently. And the opportunity in front of us is to be those companies in front of us. So understand how different this world was and is, and the models that have made big companies historically successful. It's interesting, we're now as society in the United States today, if you look at the spend of Big Pharma on R&D, they're spending about $60 billion on R&D, 60 billion. The biotech industry spends about 35 billion. NIH spends about 35 billion. So we're spending more than $100 billion on development of new stuff. And you look at what gets approved, it's almost a flat line. We're not efficient at taking all of this massive discovery and converting it into new product today. And if you look at the pharmaceutical industry as a mathematician for a minute, it used to be that it took about 7 years and a couple $100 million. That's the kind of top line. 7 years and a couple $100 million to develop a drug. If you thought about that and you have a 20-year life, you've got 13 years to recover a $200 million investment. You have kind of a lot of area under the curve. Now it takes you 15, 16 years to get there. It costs you almost $2 billion. And you've got 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years at the outside to recover it. There's no area under the curve. So if you ask why the pharmaceutical industry is in trouble, they're in deep yogurt because the math doesn't work. You can't spend $2 billion and have no time to recover it. And so most of the products that come to the market today don't recover their cost. That's non-economic. So the advantage we have in this room is that we, by and large, are a little more efficient, a little more economic in doing that. And Big Pharma's decided they'd rather pay up, buy us, than build it. So I was chairman of a company called Pharma. This is a company I helped create a while back. We just sold it for $11 billion, 3 years before the first product has any revenue. So if any of you who think revenue is a derivative of sales and EBITDA can go home, because revenue is, we're 3 years from having the first nickel of revenue and no EBITDA. We sold the company for $11 billion. Biggest deal done in the history of the biotech industry. So value can be created, and we're in the value creation business. And we're it's valuable because in this case, Gilead was willing to pay it because we had a product for hepatitis C that was very, very compelling. And so the opportunity in front of us is to create extraordinary value. And a lot of that actually happens before the first time of revenue. So it should be no surprise then that you look at our friends in Big Pharma and they are moving inorganically. That is to say, they're not looking down the hallway and saying, how are we doing, guys? They're looking outside and buying us. That's good for us. It may be dislocating for individual companies, but it's good for us to be an acquiring industry, and so we can create extraordinary value. And you see some of the local companies here who will become part of larger companies today as a result of that. My friend Chris Wiebacher, who runs Sanofi today, largest drug company in the world, says, my goal as CEO is to never inaugurate a new R&D center. I mean, this is an amazing statement for an industry historically driven by innovation. They're not going to do it today. We are the innovation, and that's good. And you look at the sales of Big Pharma, most of them are coming off patent, and so we have that as our opportunity. But if you're sitting at Big Pharma today and you look at those companies today, they look very, very different than they did before. You see Pfizer paying $68 billion to acquire Wyeth because of Wyeth's biologic platform. I wrote the business plan for Genentech a long time ago. When we sold Genentech, we as an industry sold Genentech to Roche. Roche paid $55 billion for roughly the 50% they didn't own, valuing Genentech for $100 billion. $100 billion on that day. If you went onto your Google Finance or Yahoo Finance and looked at the market cap of Pfizer, Pfizer's market cap was $91 billion. We created more value in 25 years in Genentech than the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. So we can create extraordinary value. You see Novartis, you saw Sanofi buy Genzyme for $20 billion. We're in the value creation business. Don't forget the business we're in. We're in the business of creating value. Not just financial value, but value for patients, value for our communities, value for societies, and so forth. But look at the big companies today. They're trying to figure out what is the model that I can do to be sustainable. And so they're looking at OTC conversion. They're looking at generics. They're looking at emerging markets. By the way, if you look at emerging markets, the power of brands is extraordinary. All of brands equate in emerging markets to quality. They don't know XYZ, they don't know ABC, but they do know Pfizer, they do know Novartis, they do know Bayer. And so, much like the grocery store shelf, you go and buy your wheat thins today, there's 42 different wheat thins, or there's 25 different Oreo cookies, because the power of brands is very, very important. You see that in our world. We don't think of ourselves in a branded product way, but we will see the power of that, and you can see that particularly in the emerging markets. Some of us are very involved in the biosimilars business, but why is the biosimilars business important? Well, I mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that I started in this business 45 years ago. It tells you that we have at least 20 years of stuff that's off patent. So most of the big stuff in our industry is already off patent. No surprise then that the Chinese and the Indians and the Koreans are trying to be in the biosimilars business. You go to Korea today and what do you see? You see them massive businesses in the commodity chip businesses. The Koreans own that. So why is it a surprise then when Samsung does a big deal in biosimilars? They say, that business is maturing. It's going to be a generics business. We call that biosimilars. Some people call it biobetters and other things, generic biotech. But that business is very real because our technology is 20 and 30 years old. And other players see that as a tremendous opportunity. So needless to say, the M&A world is an exciting world. There's a lot of opportunity. There were two transactions that didn't happen in the last year. It's worth a minute on them, but for different reasons. One was a Roche transaction with Illumina, and one was a GSK trying to get a hold of HGSI. Those didn't happen. And they didn't happen because the shareholders said that those companies are going to build more value than they will in the big companies. But the more interesting thing isn't that. If you look at what Roche was willing to pay, $6 billion for Illumina, what does that tell us as an industry? What is Illumina's business? Illumina is a top producer of gene sequencing machines in the world. And what Roche was willing to say is the future of biotech is diagnosis around genetic sequencing. And that's going to be the future. And we're willing to pay $6.5 billion to build that franchise around gene sequencing, because that's going to be the diagnosis of the future. That's the interesting lesson to all of us, was the value that they were willing to pay. Fortunately, my friend Jay Flatley, who runs that company, was able to convince the investors that he could build more value in that business than Roche was going to build, so he managed to keep it for a while. But there was a real lesson in how value is created in a new business called gene sequencing. So you look at your big companies today, Pfizer, which was the biggest small molecule company, is now one of the larger players in biologics. Novartis, one of the largest players in vaccines. Sanofi in consumer health and animal health and other things. Roche in nanotechnology and stem cells. Teva, the leading generics company in the world, buying Cephalon, so they're buying a biologics platform. Amgen, the leading biologics company, is doing deals with generic companies. So the language of kind of big pharma, small molecules, biotech, large molecules, it gets pretty mixed pretty quickly. But there's a lot happening, and you see these kind of unusual transactions happening in the last year. A year ago when I stood here, if I'd have told you that Samsung was willing to bet $1 billion in the biosimilars business, you would have thought I was nuts. I mean, here's a company that makes cell phones, but now they're one of the biggest players in biologics. Important to recognize, generics are a big business, whether we like that or not, but it's particularly big business in the growing markets, which are not the US and Europe. But we're here mostly to talk about innovation, and that's important to us. And the question is the innovation world different? And the answer is massively. So when I got started in this industry, writing the business plans for Genentech, Cedus, Amgen, and all those guys that we were doing in the 60s and 70s, we were able to take really interesting science and we were able to throw fair amounts of capital at that, maybe $5, $10, $50, $20 million, maybe up to $100 million. We were able to take those companies public at $300 million. The VCs got rich, the entrepreneurs got rich, the public liked it, and they took them from the $300 million to the $100 billion. Everybody won. Can't do that today. Can't do that today. So when you say, well, Steve, let's just do it the way we used to do it, you can't. And so it's worth talking about how different the capital markets are, how different the business models are. And you see this co-opetition, these companies like Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck, who are intensely competitive in some areas of the market, now cooperating intensely because they recognize that the only way they can actually do it is in this somewhat co-opetition world that we live in. You see pharma companies and others reaching into the BRIC countries, into Russia and India, China, places like that, to access low-cost labor. But if you think the real activity is because of the cost arbitrage, it's the time arbitrage. The costs have moved up relatively quickly, but you can recruit 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 500 patients overnight. And so the time arbitrage in some of these markets is far bigger than the cost arbitrage. But because of that, you see massive developments in areas of the world that historically we haven't seen a lot of development. But the other thing that I just want you to go away from here and think about is the critically important issue of our pharmacoeconomic reality. We have to understand what the payers are going to pay for. And by the way, if you run to Kaiser Permanente, they own those patients kind of from birth to death. If you go to Aetna, Aetna owns their patients on average 18 months. And so if you've got a pharmacoeconomic issue, you have to prove a different set of economics. You have to show Aetna that you're going to create value for their patient population in the 18 months that have that. Whereas when you go to Kaiser, you have to prove it in the context of how Kaiser practices medicine. So you can't take a one-size-fits-all and say, you know, I proved that this thing creates, you know, kind of on a slick board, we're able to say, here's the cost that I'm saving. You have to do that on a payer-by-payer specific basis. So this is very complex today. And what you have to understand is as we do the clinical development, we have to develop the data at the payer level. We have to understand what are the metrics the payer is going to use to prove value, because you can't just wait to get there and have to do your clinical development all over to get paid for it. And so now you see our friends in pharma who have begun to recognize that and are beginning to get involved with the payers relatively early. Now, I'll tell you something that I don't understand at all, and I think it's really screwy behavior. You think about the old world for a minute. We did really great science in academia. And then we took that science, we kind of moved it into biotech companies. We funded it with VCs, private capital stuff that we're doing. We funded those companies. We took those companies to the public equity markets, and then occasionally we sold them. That was the model, right? Academics to biotech, funded by VCs, angels, VCs, public market, success. Now, Big Pharma is saying, you know, we're going to step over all that. We're going to go back, and we're going to now fund things at the University of Washington, and we're going to fund it at UCSF and Stanford and Harvard, and we're going to use the academic world as our research lab. Now that's a great idea, except who's going to provide the $50 billion a year that we used to provide as an industry to develop all that stuff? Big Pharma said, we don't want to own the risk of development. We don't want to pay the cost of development. We'd rather buy late. But now they're reaching over us, and it's, in my view, absolutely crazy. And so they're going to lose. There's no way if Pfizer already owns it at the University of Washington, there's no way the private sector, angels, VCs, and the public equity market are going to put that $50 or $100 billion in. So the pharma industry got an enormous carry for 30 years that they just killed us. So I don't understand this, but that's going on, and you should be aware that we're now seeing tremendous funding of academic science directly by the big pharma companies, and who pays for the development of that is really going to be interesting. So maybe they're nuts, and maybe they're not. Maybe they know something I don't know, but I don't get it. I think all of that bad news, if you will, is good for us. And so one, we get our drugs approved. We can by and large get things to the market. We don't have a lot of history that shows we get them there quicker, but we do get more and more biologics through than small molecules today. You can see a lot of approvals of those things. You see a lot of acquisitions of those things. You say, what are the big drugs 5 years from now or 3 years from now? The big drugs in the market are all biologics. Historically, you go back, the big drugs in the market were all small molecules. Now the big drugs are all the stuff that are coming out of our world. And obviously, as I indicated earlier, you can see big pharma buying us. They bought Genzyme, Pharmaset, Inhibitex, Plexicon, Amylin last week, and so forth. Massive willingness to pay up to own things after risk has been removed. So then the question to you and I is, how do we fund this stuff? Steve, you've got a lot of money. We've got $1.5 billion in our venture business. That makes us pretty popular. But are you willing to do the things that you used to do? And the answer is no. We have almost no appetite today when you come in with your preclinical indication and you say, you know, I can prove in the lab and I can prove in some relevant animal model that this stuff works pretty well. And the VC is saying, I got to get 5x my money in 3 years. How's this going to happen? And so we have a giant challenge in funding innovation today that we didn't have before. Notwithstanding that, if you look at the last year, we raised more money in this industry than we ever did in the history of the industry. So we ought to stand up and applaud ourselves. From a year ago when we were here to a year today, we raised more money than we ever did in tough capital markets. We're pretty creative. And we did it because we had to, not because we wanted to, and not because value was on our side. We did it because we had to. You look at it, we raised a lot of money through debt. Debt by and large are for the larger companies. You and I can't build our innovation around debt. So the bad news is we don't have as much money at the early stage as we need. And the VCs, quite frankly, have by and large dried up. They're not there early. So if you look at venture capital financing, it's down very, very dramatically. Most of it's going to relatively few companies. But here's a really interesting phenomena, particularly interested when you look at the Pacific Northwest. Angels today represent, in the aggregate, as much capital coming in as VCs. So we happen to live in a community here in Seattle where we have a lot of wealth that's been created around the Amazons, around the Microsofts, around the Nordstroms and others that have become big players. Starbucks and others have become big players. And many of those people, their mothers and fathers are dying of this disease or that disease. They have passion, as Jeff talked about this morning, and they've created foundations and others, and they're angels. So we have lots of angel networks today that have come in and have been substituted as the VCs have exited. The problem with angels is they're not very well organized. And the other problem is, this is an opportunity, but a problem, is they're not very value specific. They're not very value smart. And so they're trying to do something for Aunt Martha, or they're trying to do something for the mother. And so the good news is it's cheap capital for you. So you get $1 or $2 or $5 million to do your startup with some angel next door, and you think that's really good. Sounds good, you got capital relatively cheap. But when you go back to them and you say, you know, I need another 5 or 10 or 20 million bucks, they say, hey, you know, I did my thing. And so then the VCs come in and they crush those guys because the valuations were too high, and they come in and say, you know, it shouldn't have been done at $5 a share, should have been done at 50 cents a share, and now everybody's mad because they've revalued it. So this is good. There's lots of capital available. It's challenging because a lot of the values get distorted against where the markets really are. And as most of you know today, you can find public companies with significant development. I happen to be on the board of a company called Targacept. Targacept today is a company, we're a decade into it. This is a company that uses nicotinic receptors, and we treat Alzheimer's and cognition and obesity and things like that. Company's been around 12 years. We had some giant deals. Some of those things failed recently, but we're sitting today with $225 million in cash and $140 million in market cap, trading at a discount of about 50% to cash. So if you buy companies at 50% of their cash balance, why is it interesting for the VCs to invest in some early stage technology that's hundreds of millions of dollars from getting somewhere? So you can't ignore the fact that the public markets aren't valuing what we're doing very well. That's why the IPOs are bad. But that because the public markets aren't doing well, capital is far more expensive and less available than it ever was. You guys here in the Pacific Northwest are doing relatively well. So if you look at the Bay Area and you look at Boston, they get the majority of the VC money, but this area has done very well on a relative basis, and I think will continue to. But capital is available. You should leave this room knowing there's plenty of capital to do good things. So if you've got good things, there is capital. Maybe more expensive than it was, but there's capital available to you. Problem is that we finance lots of things that probably shouldn't have been financed. Look at the public equity markets, you'll see that in the last 6 months of this year, we've done better. So in the first half of this year, we kind of tracked all the other indices, but if you look at the Burrill Select, which is kind of a Dow Jones of biotech, we've done better in the last 6 months. Why is that? Is it because the economy's good? No. It's because Pharmaceutical was acquired for $11 billion. It's because Amylin was just acquired. It's because people say, you know, somebody's going to buy these companies and they're going to pay a big premium because their premiums are 30, 50, 80% of the market price. So the markets are going up today in our world because people think that there's a premium and that the Dendrions of the world are going to be bought. They're going to be bought at a big premium. The indices, by and large, are much better than they were a year ago. The public markets are choppy. After the Facebook face plant, I think we had no real IPOs in the market in any industry for 4 weeks. They're now beginning to crawl in. We had a few biotech deals getting done. But if you look at the biotech deals, they're getting done how? They're getting done at 5 and 6 and 7, not at the 11 to 13 that the bankers put on the cover. What does that mean? The buy side, the institutional investors who are buying the IPOs are saying, you know, I'll pay what Steve paid. So the VCs are getting no return, the entrepreneurs are getting no return. They're buying it at the gross amount of invested capital, and they're saying, if it works, well, I'll do okay. If it doesn't work, screw it. I'm not going to give Steve any return for what he's done. And that discourages me then from doing what I'm doing. So the VCs aren't very happy because there's no capital, there's no return for the risks they've taken. And if you want to get your public offering off, you can get it off today, but it'll be at a price that you'll wish you hadn't. So the public markets are very, very difficult. You can see the performance of the more recent IPOs, and then you look at what happens after you go public and they go down. So now I run to Wall Street with my great company and I tell my friends on Wall Street, this is a great company. And they say, Steve, I love your company, I love you, but it's going to be cheaper to buy tomorrow. I'll wait because the stocks are going down. So there's no incentive for the buy side to get into these things because the price is going to go down. So it isn't like you got things that come at 30 and go to 60. When we did the Genentech IPO, most of you are too young to know this, we came at 35. The first trade was at 86. We don't live in that world anymore. So don't pretend. So the IPO market is there, but it's not very attractive. So capital is available. It's difficult. It's expensive. There's substantial regional differences. You read all the time in the paper about a financing happen. You kind of scratch your head and say, how'd that happen? There are lots of ways to raise capital today, but it will take a premium on creativity. And you can see by the statistics that M&A is far more popular today than going public. So one of the things to recognize is the way we build companies today are going to be different. The business models are different. The VCs are trying to find a more efficient use of their money. Governments want to build their economies. Academic institutions are looking for research money and so forth. So there's plenty of money. You just got to weave your way through that system. If you take things like what Carl Weissman is doing up here with his incubator, it's a very innovative model. It was not widely recognized a number of years ago when Carl did that, but it's a very successful model where you don't create a company around every idea. You companyize them later. You leverage a management team, you leverage structures. Big difference between an incubator and an accelerator, but the accelerator model, which is not a companyization of every idea model, is a pretty innovative way to do it today, and we see that growing up. In our case at Burrill, we've raised money from the Russians, we've made money from the Taiwanese, we've raised money in Brazil and elsewhere. You see governments all over the world willing to put money in innovation. So the question to you is not just how do I get Alan Fraser to do something, but how do I get the government of Brazil or China or India or some other place to want to finance my innovation? And by the way, it may be a lot easier to get to the market in those places than it is to go through the FDA. And so now you see a lot of innovation where what we're trying to do is figure out how we use foreign capital and how we take those products to markets in other markets than the US, as the FDA probably does not become the gold standard anymore, but a late adapter, because there's far more capital and more interest in other places in the world. And the other thing is where Jeff Wakes was talking about this morning. If you look at the power of the advocacy organizations, they have a substantial role today in the development of solutions to their problems. If you really cut through what the Gates Foundation is doing, they're going to become like a pharmaceutical company. They built their model on partnerships that were going to help everybody give money to all the right people around the world, kind of make it work. And they've kind of drawn back and said, you know, that didn't work very well. And so Jeff's kind of doing his landscape analysis to try and figure out how they make their partners more effective. But if you look at Trevor and the people that are coming into that organization today, they're going to figure out, here's a problem, here's a molecule, what do I have to do to develop it? And they're going to actually look a whole lot more like an integrated pharmaceutical company, where they look at better diagnosis and better treatment, and they're going to create. So the role of these disease advocacy organizations has been very, very real. And if you look at the financings, instead of running to your local VC today, what people are doing is they're running to the organization that has a real interest in that disease and getting capital from those people rather than from their angel next door or from a VC. And as I mentioned, if you look at the model that we used to do, we had this idea, we formed a company, got a board, we got a CEO and a CFO and a CSO and a CMO, and we got all these people in the company. We developed the product that we got to POC and we went public. That model doesn't work today. And so now the question is, how do you take risk out of that? How do you leverage things like Carl is trying to do? How do you leverage models that basically you can companyize later? Maybe you don't even have to companyize, you can just sell that idea after you get to POC. And so the business models of today are quite different. I think this is an area that has extraordinary opportunity, in part because there's a set of skills here that's beyond just drug discovery and development, and that's called IT and informatics. I'll talk about that in a minute. You can see lots of local successes. Chris certainly did a nice job in his opening comments this morning talking about the progress that we've made locally. But if you think about healthcare for a minute, you have to think about it in the context of 3 or 4 players. One are patients, you and I, who want better healthcare, things that work. We have to think about the payers and their stake in it, that is to say, who pays, governments, insurance companies, and others. We have to think about providers. The providers are being dislocated today. And we have to think about technology. We have to think much more holistically about the healthcare system around us. And so if I take out my iPhone for a minute, I showed some of you this. I think I may have shown some of you this last year, but I can push buttons on my iPhone. And right through my shirt, I can see my EKG live. Now, you can't see that in the back of the room, but there's 7 billion people in the room, in the world today. 7 billion people. 6 billion of them have cell phones. So if you say, how is healthcare going to be transformed? It's being transformed by a different set of technology. So if I can do my EKG on my iPhone through my shirt, and you can do blood pressure and glucose, and you can spit on a microfluidic chip that we put in here, and you can diagnose disease differently, and you can cough into your cell phone, and you can take pictures of these blemishes that you have a different technology. Think about Seattle for a minute. We got Amazon, we got Boeing. Those guys have learned how to take big data, terabytes of data coming off the jet engine, Amazon dealing with massive amounts of data. All of those skills are really important as we're dealing with a different course of delivery. And so the world of healthcare is not just being transformed by the stuff we're doing in small and large molecules, but by a transformation around new technology. 55% of the drugs we use in the United States don't work for the patients. 55%. If you were the head of healthcare in the United States, you'd kind of like to eliminate that. So you're very willing to pay for things that work. The question is, how do we know what works for Steve and what works for somebody else? So if you look at things like cancer, 75% of stuff we do with cancer doesn't work. Did a poll of the American people, and they said of the total healthcare cost, how much of the cost of healthcare in this country is for drugs? And you know what the American people said? 65%. It's less than 10. Well, we become the bad guys because we're perceived to be, got these little pills that cost $10,000 a year. Somebody's ripping off the system, so we're perceived to be the problem. The problem is that most stuff that we're doing doesn't work. We're spending extraordinary amounts of money in this country for stuff that doesn't work. And so where we're moving to is a world that we're going to know what works for Steve, and we're going to know, more importantly, what's going to happen to Steve, and we're going to deal preemptively rather than dysfunctionally. And everybody has an interest in that. Patients want that. Doctors want to actually do things that work. Drug makers would much rather sell things that work. Regulators obviously want it. Everybody wants it. So we fell in love with personalized medicine, and I ran around the world being a big advocate for personalized medicine, and all I can tell you is we were a little ahead of it because the science kind of hasn't held up quite as fast. We had relatively early data, relatively early algorithms that didn't altogether work, and so we've got some kind of spurious science out there, and you've got a lot of retraction. So we've taken a little bit of a setback, but we know absolutely that we begin to understand what will work and what doesn't work and why it is, and those algorithms are getting better and better. And don't write off personalized medicine, but don't be naive about the complexity of getting there. So a slide I dredged up from something I did a number of years ago. We're moving into this truly different world of genomic medicine, where we understand disease differently. We've redefined disease differently. We understand that we as patients are highly variable. We understand that we can now get to individualized treatment, and we believe that we can get to preemptive care. And that will all happen and is happening over the next few years. And so by the time we get to 2020, it's real different. And if you think about the healthcare system, then we've lived in a healthcare system around the world, which was by and large on the left, dealing with acute care, dealing with patients who were pretty sick and dying. We put them in hospitals and we treated them dysfunctionally. And the whole healthcare system was based on cost. Now, everything's different. We have massive cost of chronic care. We have systems and software that allow us to understand that. We're dealing with technology that I have in my pocket that's going to consumerize this, and we're paying for value. So everything we did in the healthcare world before is now changing. And if you say, well, what does that mean to patients? Patients used to be kind of passive about their health care. They kind of waited for things to happen, and then they went to the doctor and said, hey, doc, what's going on? And he looked at us for a while, and he asked about our mother and father, and he asked what we had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and kind of what kind of weird behavior we did. And we peed in a bottle, or they stuck blood in a tube, and they sent it over to a lab. And 3 days later, that lab result came back, and the doctor called you up and said, hey, Steve, why don't you come down here? And he said, here's what's wrong with it. That's a healthcare system. We've had that healthcare system for 2,000 years. I mean, 2,000 years ago, what did we do? We waited for disease to happen. We went to the local healer. He tried to do something. It didn't work, and you died. Today, we do the same thing. We wait for disease to happen. You go to the doc. 75% of stuff doesn't work, and we die. So the future is very different. Now we're going to manage our state of wellness. We have technology. You can get up in the morning, you have a little microfluidics chip. We have a little integrated chip under your skin. You can put it under some reader and you can figure out what your blood pressure is and what you had too much to drink last night. My cholesterol's a little high. I got to tweak that. We're going to live in a world where we manage things differently. So patients today are going to have tremendous knowledge. We're at the early stages of that. That's electronic health records and others. We're using social media. We have the gaming guys that are in. You get all these little incentives. If you kind of take your 10,000 steps today, I got to get 11,000 steps tomorrow. We're using Fitbit and other things to try and manage your state of wellness. Absolute rapid transformation. Doctors used to be God, right? Doctors are being fired today as being God. They hope to be rehired as advisors because you now know what's going on. You've got technology that'll tell you what's going on. You have technology that is far beyond the WebMDs, or you used to dial up WebMD and try and do it, and you went in with your 3-ring binder. Now you get real data. You got clinical data. You've got, you spit on your BlackBerry and it went up to the cloud. And so doctors who used to kind of deal with trial and error and were the unquestioned authority and by and large were treating disease, hope they have a role in trying to be your health counselor. They're going to help us stay well. That's a dramatic difference. Remember, doctors make their living by treating sick people. Keeping everybody out of their office doesn't work. I'll give you one little example. We were about to invest in a company the other day. We fell in love with the technology. It was once-a-year technology. The existing technology in the market was these doctors see their patients once a month. They do this stuff. So we had once-a-year technology replacing essentially once a month real expensive technology. We didn't invest in that company. Why? Because that doctor's never going to write the script. The minute he writes that script, he writes himself out of business. So perverse incentives exist. We have a sickness care system where 20% of our GDP are people who are not going to go away quietly. So don't misunderstand the complexity of this change, and it's all happening and will happen in the next few years. And so we're redefining disease, we're redefining medicine, we're redefining everything. And it's all driven by the fact that we now have information that is not available. I showed some of you this chart a year ago. The blue line is Moore's Law. I think all of you up here understand Moore's Law. We decided, Gordon Moore and friends, that we could double the number of transistors on a chip every 18 months, and that was Moore's Law. If you look at us, we're moving logarithmically faster, reducing the cost of biologic information. So if we can go from computers the size of this building to computers that are more powerful in our pocket in 25 years, just think ahead where we're moving logarithmically faster of how we're going to be transformative to healthcare. So I have my genome sequence. We can sequence our genome today for $1,000 commercially. You can do it for a couple $100 if you have the right friends. So we can sequence everybody in this room now relatively cheaply. We're going to take all that data and we're going to do something with it. And so we've got genomic data and transcriptomics and proteomics and metabolomics. We have all this data. We're throwing it all up into the sky. We have massive data today. We've redefined diseases. We take diseases that were relatively simple diseases like red or white blood cell disease. Today it's 100 different diseases. So we've redefined disease, we've redefined the roles, and it's all based around extraordinary amounts of information. And so we're going to live in a world where we have massive amounts of information, and therefore you go to the terabytes of information, the petabytes of information that are coming off the jet engines. There are some skills that we can learn from other industries that are very helpful to us as we try and take all this data from electronic health records, data from my real-time monitoring of my heart, data from my pharmacy, data from all the omics data, massive amount of data. We've converted biology to a data business. That's a new world for us, but it's very big. And so we've got to convert all of that data into insight into improved healthcare. That's the challenge in front of us. I would argue this community, better positioned than many, because of some of the larger companies that have been here and have developed enormous informatics skills. And so obviously that's valuable to you and I as patients and as consumers. It's valuable to the providers and the payers and the doctors and so forth. Interestingly enough, if you were in Walgreens' boardroom today, Walgreens will tell you that they're going to account for 30% of the healthcare spend in the country because they're going to take this kind of technology and other kinds of technology that they have available, and you're going to go in there and you're going to put your hand on a pad or you're going to spit on a chip, And we're going to be able to do most of the things that you do in the primary care system today. You're going to be able to do that at your local Walgreens or Walmart. Mayo Clinic has already decided that flying 747s into Rochester or into Phoenix is not going to happen. You got to put the Mayo Clinics in a Mall of America today. You got to take the healthcare system out to where the people are, not bring the people to where the healthcare system is. And so data is transforming all of that. So we're going to learn a lot from some of these other industries. This world of social media that I talked about, incredibly powerful. We forget how quickly we adapt to technology. So we forget about how we've moved from kind of watching TV to on-demand viewing. We forget about how we moved from the PC to the tablet, or from hard drives to the clouds, or software to apps, or phones to smartphones, fossil fuels to renewable. All overnight, we live in a world of new technology, and it's never really affected healthcare till now. And now it's affecting everything. And so you see this massive change around the value of technology. So we have high-speed, low-cost sequencing. We have artificial intelligence and robotics, smart spills and stem cells and gene therapy and synthetic biology. Think about synthetic biology as a set of Lego blocks. We can put stuff together today that we couldn't put together. And we don't do it on the human side because everybody's worried about that. But we do it on the ag side. We do it on the bioenergy side, biofuel side, because we don't really worry about plants. So it's okay to use synthetic biology there. It's not okay to use it on humans. We're going to use it on humans too. It doesn't mean we're going to create designer people, but we're going to use it for better diagnosis and better treatment. And we've got these mobile technologies that I just showed you. I've got 3 form factors for my EKG. We've got a pad you can put your hand on. We've got a smart Band-Aid that you can put on. You can do 24/7 monitoring. I know that I'm going to get a heart attack before I get it. Very, very powerful technology being driven. And this is the world that this is biotech circa 2020. This isn't small molecules and large molecules. So this technology, if any of you want to see it, you can go on Alive Core is the name of the company, and you can see this. We have a nice little website, not demonstration, but it's only one example of how rapidly the smartphone is changing. There are 1.1 million apps for your iPhone today. 1.1 million apps. How many do you have on your phone? Right? So everybody's saying, look, I got all these. There are 250,000 of them are for healthcare. Figure that one out. So there's lots of misinformation in the system as well. So my friend Eric Topol wrote an interesting book about the convergence of medicine, the critical destruction of medicine, creative destruction of medicine. Should be mandatory reading for all of you, but don't misunderstand how different the world of 2020 is from the world of today, driven by essentially a different set of technologies. Now in areas like this, we're going to recognize the things we're doing in the non-healthcare side are just as big. We're worried about the use of land for different purposes, but we're going to grow our biomass and we're going to convert that biomass into specialty chemicals and specialty biologics, sugars and starches and other things. And so the same revolution that's going on the healthcare side of the world is going on in the non-healthcare side, essentially driven around industrial biotech or driven around new technologies. We've got some challenge. We got those companies financed. We put in money that proved the technology worked. There's this thing called a pilot plant that's $300 to $500 million before the offtake works. And so a lot of these companies went public. They're struggling today. We own a bunch of them. But the same phenomena that is going on the healthcare side is going on the non-healthcare side. And so the big companies are changing. The value around technology is very, very real. So let me just wrap up with a couple of conclusions. First is the pharmaceutical industry is changing dramatically. These are my dinosaurs. They're going from kind of science invented to distributors. They're going to look a lot more like Walmart than they do anything else. You're going to move from where we had cost-based reimbursement to where we have value-based. Don't underestimate the complexity of calculating value. It's not something you do in your office on a slick board. It's payer dependent. And if you're going to sell it to the Chinese, or you're going to sell it to the Indians, or you're going to sell it to Kaiser Permanente or Aetna, each one of those buyers has a different dynamic to their economic equation. And so it's very, very complex, and we are, as an industry, naive about that. Power has moved from the doctor to the payer. So if you want to know who God is today, God is the payer. We may not like that. It doesn't mean this is a managed care revolution which failed. But he who pays for it, the governments who pay for it, the insurance companies who pay for it, the employers who pay for it, they will determine the health care that people get. Although copays will go up and we'll become more sensitive to our cost of sickness, God is on the side of the payer. Historically, we've been in a world, a triad of US, Europe, Japan. We said that, those are the three markets we used to worry about. Those markets in the future are less than 50%. 55% of the market in the future are the BRIC countries. Those countries represented less than 15% of the market 5 years ago. A totally different marketplace exists for us. The companies that are strong today in the US, Europe, Japan are not the companies that are strong in those markets. Financing was simple. We did kind of VC, IPO, sell the company. Financing is complex today. Don't underestimate the creativity necessary to build a company today. The FDA, the gold standard, I would argue our job today is to figure out how we avoid those guys. It's kind of a black hole. My friend Peggy Hamburg runs it. We're great friends. We talk about it all the time. The issue is how do you get it into a market any place in the world other than the United States first. Capital is available. Marketplaces are available. We're going to move from that gold standard to something else. We're going to change the place where you get healthcare delivered. You don't go to the doctor, you go to Walmart, you go to the Minute Clinic, you go to Walgreens. You're going to deal with doctors who had information to you and I have it because we spit on our cell phone or we have EKGs that we can show. We're moving from hard copy to soft copy. We're moving to a world of massive disruptive innovation that will change everything. This is a fabulous, fabulous time to be in this business. Valuations are lower than they've ever been. Power's on my side of the table as an investor, not the entrepreneurs. That's not good, but don't underestimate the power of capital. I need you, you need me. I've got capital, you're not going to get anywhere without capital. I need your ideas. I'm not going to get anywhere with my capital without your ideas. So we're going to arm wrestle on value. It's not a mathematical thing. Don't come in with all your quant jocks to try and tell me about value. We'll just arm wrestle on value. But don't be naive about what the public companies are worth today, because if you start with what public companies are worth, you can go back to what you're worth. It isn't some DCF model that you want to do. But I would argue the opportunities to build value in our industry have never been better than they are today. The austerity that we have in the world today, austerity is the name of my new book, drives capital efficiency. It's changed the business model. It imposes a certain amount of discipline. We'll put some things in the refrigerator and wait a few years. It causes us to prioritize, and it causes us to focus on value build. Remember, we're in the value building business. Value is not a derivative of sales and earnings. We as a country amassed enormous energy around the space program. We have the same energy today. My meetings in China are with the Prime Minister of China, with the leaders of the Chinese government this weekend. Every government in the world has said, Steve, we want to build what you guys have built in the United States. Everybody's looking to us. You need to turn that around and say that's extraordinary opportunity. Sources of capital, it's marketplaces, it's people that want you there. Understand they're different. Don't go into this Chindia world. China and India are as different as any two countries could be. So understand the nuances of that. You got to build products for tomorrow's market. Think about what I showed you. Think about how healthcare is going to be delivered and how it's going to be paid for in 2020. It has nothing to do with how healthcare is delivered and paid for today. So don't build a product for today's world. Build a product for tomorrow's world and be awfully insightful about how different that is. And we're healing and fueling and feeding the world, and we're really making a difference. Thank you very much.
Steve, fantastic and extremely thought-stimulating. I'm sure words of wisdom for everybody in the room. Just logistically, the breakout sessions start again at 1:45. We do have a gift here for you, Steve, if I can find it. Here we are. I hope in your travels that you can find time to drink this, and we can always have it shipped down to your office.
I have to drink this before my flight.
There you go. It'll help the flight go quicker. But we, again, appreciate your partnership on the conference and also appreciate your insight on what's happening and where we're going. So thank you very much. Safe travels, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next year. Take care. Thanks, everybody.